Well, this is like maybe the more interesting takeaway for people, and something that I've struggled with as a founder in the first two companies we started, and a little bit in this new one I'm starting now. But the US tax code is really not employee friendly. It's very founder friendly, but it is not employee friendly. And it was never designed necessarily to solve this problem, but the consequences of it are fairly negative for employees who join later in the cycle for this one, like really kind of stupid reason, which is, and I'll try my best to explain the basics of it, but uh, when you get your equity, your ownership in a startup in the beginning, right? When the company is just being formed and you're maybe one of like the first 5 or 10 employees or something along those lines, and definitely if you're the founders, the IRS views the value of that company basically at zero. If you kind of if you get your equity prior to the financing round, or if you only raise a little bit of money, you can basically say, look, this company is worth nothing. It has nothing. It has no money. And so as a result, when I'm giving myself equity, the gain, because I'm getting something, right? I get equity in this company. As a result, the gain that I receive is so low that the taxes on it are irrelevant, right? If it's worth $5 or $10, so I pay a bunch of taxes, but it's really, I pay basically no taxes rather. And the benefit of that is that you now own the equity and your long-term capital gains clock starts ticking, right? Meaning that if in the future your company sells and somebody gives you cash for your equity, you're going to pay long-term capital gains on that equity instead of income tax. And that's like a material difference for a lot of people, depending on what state that they live in, right? If you don't live in a high income tax state like New York, it's even bigger, right? Because then you're basically paying exclusively federal long-term gains, which could be like 20-25% or something. Uh, as an employee, if you join downstream, the reason you get options instead of like equity that vests over time is if you were to give employees equity at that time, the equity now has value, right? It has like real value to it. And so you would actually have to pay taxes on the equity, even though you can't get any money from the equity. So your employees would be liable for a tax bill, but not have any money. And so as a result, what we've kind of like worked around, if you will, in the startup ecosystem over the last 15 years is like, all right, we're not going to give you equity. We're going to give you options. And those options are basically like the chance to have equity in the future. It's a legal right to the equity in the future, but you don't actually own it, right? Because you don't actually own the equity, you just have an option. And it works except for that long-term capital gains clock. And that's where it breaks down, right? Which is that you don't actually own the equity. And so if somebody were to come in and buy you as the business, or buy the company that you work for rather, and then you exercise your options, you get your equity. Unfortunately, you haven't held them for the long-term capital gains 12 months. And so now you're paying like crazy high income tax rates, basically in some cases, like, over 50%. And so that's why you see executives who are coming in late, borrowing money to do the early exercise thing, so that if this company were successful over time, they would be able to save like a whole bunch of money on taxes. And then they do all these like crazy cockamamie schemes that we just saw, right? Which is like they borrow money from the company to early exercise and they sell some of their equities. And it all comes down to this like stupid accounting issue related to like long-term gains versus short-term gains, which in a really weird way actually disincentivizes innovation, because you want people to take risk. Like as an economy, as the US economy, you want people to take on economic risk because risk creates in the aggregate innovation and productivity, and as a result, reward. And we're actually like disincentivizing people to do it in the tax code. And that to me is like the more interesting issue in all of this, which is like, look at all the crazy hoops people are going through to just like shift their equity from short-term to long-term gains. And if we just solve this by saying, hey, actually, if you give people equity in this private company until they can actually get cash for it, there's no tax bill, right? You delay the tax, or some version of this that allows that long-term gain clock to kick in. This problem somewhat goes away. I'm sure there's some other negative externalities I haven't thought about,
Yeah.
but that's the source of this issue. At least that's my impression.
I mean, listen, I think the market determines what is
Yeah.
market and what is fair, right? And so, or market and therefore what is fair. And so, does it feel fair when you've been at a company for 6 years and a CEO has been there for two, or a CRO is making, you're an engineer and you've been there for 5 years and you're making 200K and the CRO is making 700K at OTE, like that certainly doesn't feel fair because you're building the product and he is just selling it. But somehow that has been decided that that is the market for these different talents and these different people. And so I think the market has determined that that is the commiserate things that different people could negotiate. Right. So
Yeah, I think like we should be comfortable with two things. One is that the market, it's a private company. It can do what it wants. We want private companies to be able to do what they want because they can innovate in different places. And by the way, as an employee, you have the ultimate opportunity to change jobs. Like if you don't like how that company is working, you're not an indentured servant. Like you can get up and, speak with your feet and switch jobs. And so as a result, it's not, I would make the argument that it's not supposed to be fair and we shouldn't pretend that it's fair, right? Like senior executives and founders get better deals because investors view them as more important to the company. I think where the issue, and I agree with that, by the way, to a point where there are clearly like people in a company who are just simply more important because they're better at their job and they have a skill set that's particularly unique. That's really the key, right? They're uniquely good at something. Where the issue stems, and this is the part I would agree with the employee base, is lack of transparency. Like this stuff is kind of done in quiet and secret and not disclosed. And that's the part that I think really is where the issue, leaving aside the fact that we should probably just fix this in the tax code. It seems unfair to be able to do these things without at least disclosing that they're happening, right? That people should be aware that this kind of stuff happens. And it's funny because in an acquisition scenario, right, when you get bought as a company, we had to go through this at both my companies because they both got bought, one by Google, one by Roche. And in both situations, I believe actually maybe just in the Roche situation, when the acquiring company gives like golden handcuffs, they give retention basically to employees who are incoming, there's actually a disclosure they have to give. It's called like a 280G disclosure. I don't remember the exact legal phrase. I think it's 280G. Anyway, the point is like the money that's going, the excess dollars that are going to senior executives actually get disclosed to all shareholders. And since employees own equity in the company, they get to see the disclosure. And I remember actually at Flatiron, we were doing this, we had a bunch of senior executives who were going to make quite a bit, 7-figure plus in retention compensation. And part of it was knowing we had to disclose it. What does that conversation look like? How do we discuss this? What is the blowback going to be? It wasn't like good or bad. It was just a discussion that had to be had because of the disclosure. And I think that was actually like a really healthy discussion about like what's fair, what's not fair.
it's like the New York Times rule of like, do you want to do something that would end up, and maybe it's the information rule now. Do you want to do something that ends up on the front page of the information, right? Or
Yes.
for all your employees to know it. And there are, it should be pointed out. One, and I think companies aren't democracies, right? Like we don't have all equal votes in making decisions. And two, there are other things, right? I don't know if you guys had this in this example, but like they will often, instead of just doing a top up or whatever, they will make you revest shares that you already had vested, right? As an incentive, as a executive coming on, right? And so you might own 2% of the company and it sells for $100 million and you're not getting $2 million in your pocket day one. They might say, hey, we'll give you $1 million and we'll give you, 250 over the next 4 years. And then maybe we'll add another million on top of it for each, whatever year you stay. And so like it could be a $3 million package, but you're not getting all of that day one. Right. And so again, it sort of goes back to the point that like executives are treated differently in general, right, wrong, or indifferent.
Look, this comes down to like, there is a balance between you want to let the private markets do their thing. You want to let them innovate and compete and offer giant compensation packages to people they think are great and have it work and have it not work. And this is the beauty of the market, right? Which is it's going to try a bunch of things and some stuff works and some stuff doesn't. And that's what gets us to productivity gains. But when it does it in these like very opaque ways without disclosures and just like knowing what the basic facts are, then you get yourself in trouble. then you get like scams and issues. And that's part of like this argument, not to always shy everything back to stupid Web3 stuff, but that was like the argument I was getting in with Sam about like buying equity in small little LLCs without information rights is like a completely insane idea, right? You need to understand the basics of these businesses. And that's why there are rules in place, in particular, as obviously as public companies, of like information that has to be disclosed and checked. Even in private companies, right? Like private investors have information rights and the management team knows who has those information rights. Like those are important tools we have in the toolbox to kind of have some check and balances on back office dealing and scam. And it still happens too, but at least it's a check in place. I think a lot of this stuff ends up coming down to that. Like, I think you said it right. It's the New York Times
Yeah.
disclosure issue, right? Like it's not about legal, not legal, or right or wrong. It's just, it feels wrong when you do it in a sneaky, quiet way. And I agree, you should strive to like, we're going to do something that ultimately we would be interested and willing to defend in a public setting.